So this is the first of my series of my attempts to show what I've been doing outside. The first trip that I'm going to try to document is one that I took in September up to Baxter State Park. That's Katahdin from the distance. It was about a 3-hour drive, I think, to get up to the gate, which is the north gate. Normally when I've gone in the past, about half the time we go to the south gate because we go up to areas near Katahdin. Otherwise there were a couple times where a group of us would go earlier and we go up to the north end, which is a lot more remote and not very heavily used. If you look at the big map of the area that includes the whole park, that's Katahdin in the center, and where I went was a place called Lake Matagamon, which is at the far north end of the park. It's the very northern edge. There's a campsite called Second Lake Campsite. There's actually a First Lake Campsite also. You put in at the far south end where there's a kind of close to a dam, and had to carry all my gear with me. It was about a 5-mile trip, and it took me about an hour and a half with 70 pounds of gear stuffed into the kayak. I didn't really know exactly where the campsite was, but I had a map that I had kind of figured out approximately where it was. I had a GPS with me so I could navigate a little bit if I couldn't find landmarks, which actually was kind of difficult. I got there, it was pretty close to sunset by the time I arrived. The ranger actually asked if she thought I was going to have enough time to get there because it was quite a haul, but I did manage to just pull in a little bit before the sun went down. The water level was really low, and I think you used to be able to pull up almost right to the campsite, but in this case you had to pick up all your gear and kind of haul it up over this little hill. And the campsite's pretty primitive. There's a picnic table and an outhouse, and that's about it, which is kind of nice. The only way to get there is by water. I think the rangers actually have to take a power boat or a float plane to get up there if they have to do anything. I assume that I never saw anybody. Actually, on the whole trip on the lake, I saw about 5 people, and most of them were in fishing boats. So I got there probably within about 15 minutes of getting everything set up. It was dark, and so people had left firewood around. I was able to just harvest a bunch of wood that was there and have a good campfire. So the first day of stuff that I wanted to do, I wanted to go down to a place where we had stayed in the past. There's a pond called South Branch, and there's some mountains right around there, and there's one called North Traveler. So I hopped in the canoe, did my hour-and-a-half paddle, and drove about half an hour down to this campsite. And they always have this goofy sign there that tells you not to take your bikes in the water. But the mountain has a couple of peaks, so there's kind of a false peak where you think you're near the top, but I only climbed about part way up because it took me a while to get out there. And if you zoom in, that's approximately where my campground is. So I got done with that, paddled back, and I think made my first progress report.
Starting to pick up out of the south, which made it really tricky coming out of the main launch area. There's one closer that could potentially access this spot, but they say it's so low that you're having to drag everything through there to get up here. So I'm still stuck with this 5-mile traverse with a lot of weather. And I'll try to show you later, I have this nice blood blister started on my hand in spite of wearing gloves at this point. I'm going to try and gather some firewood because I know it's going to rain starting later tonight, and hopefully I'll have a nice campfire again. So far so good. I'm just tired. It's supposed to be.
I did mess around with some cooking. These are some scones that I made on a camp stove that I had brought, and that's the wood pile. I've kind of augmented it a little bit. So the second night I had a fire. The next day I decided I would take a little bit shorter trips. I decided that I would try to hike first down to a campground that was nearby, kind of the nearest on the lake. I thought it was just around that little bend. There was a lot of woods that I tried to work through, and it actually turned out to be a lot more difficult than I expected. So I think I made it about halfway. Then I came back and I figured I'd paddle out to the far end of the lake just to see what it was like at the end there. There's another campground at the far end, which I eventually got to. With that river entrance, there's actually a waterfall somewhere.
I came from. This is kind of north. That's northwest toward the end of the lake. I'm going to try to go that way in a minute. This is Northwest Cove Campground. wind is picking up, rain is picking up, so I'm gonna head back. Hopefully I'll be able to jump up on the north shore and kind of stay up there for a while, and then I'll be a little protected.
So I paddled back. I don't remember exactly what my mileage was, but when I got back I discovered that the ground had become completely saturated and there were pretty significant lakes of water forming all around and partly under the tent. So I had to pull all my stuff out and move the tent before I ended up floating on a lake. At that point I also discovered that the tarp that I had brought, which was something I had just kind of made from some fabric, was not waterproof at all and had actually developed a bunch of pinholes where I'd used it to cover the firewood.
Actually mildly hypothermic because I've been sitting out in the rain for probably an hour and a half, and this jacket, while it seems to keep me pretty dry, is not by any stretch of the imagination warm, and I'm wicking things up into my sleeves. So I'm going to see if I can actually get this place kind of dried out a little bit. It's pretty decided slope now, but that should be okay. It looks like everything's staying dry on the inside at least.
So after change of clothes I'm feeling better. I'm still a little bit wet, but you can see how kind of chilly it was. It never got, I think it got into the 50s for the most part that whole weekend, and finally spent the last night, headed home. Was really a good trip. So I'll see you next time. It's getting to be pretty chilly out, which means for me winter hiking.